Todd, your group has really been out there kind of on the YIMBY, the yes in my backyard, and have kind of engaging with millennials around these conversations about growth and housing. What are you seeing, and when you're having those conversations, what are they saying, or what are their fears?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Yes in My Backyard movement in San Francisco, the YIMBYs. They're amazing. Like, they are a phenomenal group who is literally changing the conversation in San Francisco and at City Hall. And we can actually have conversations about middle-income housing. You know, a year ago, I was working on Senator Wiener's campaign. I was his political director, and Scott, you know, is obviously a very pro-housing person. You could not have a conversation a year ago in San Francisco about middle-income housing. Could not. You would be like, you know, I believe that someone showed up to a planning commission meeting and referred to middle-income housing as ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing, Calvin Welch. Quote him, showed up and said that, yeah, if you do middle-income housing, you're doing ethnic cleansing.
Okay, Todd, just what is middle-income housing?
Middle-income, so good question. So we were talking about Home SF at Katie Tang. So a year ago or 2 years ago, Home SF was called the Affordable Housing Bonus Program. Marketing matters. The Affordable Housing Bonus Program could not get a vote at the Board of Supervisors. Basically the exact same program, rebranded as Home SF. YIMBY's changing the conversation in San Francisco. It gets passed by the Board of Supervisors a couple of weeks ago, 11-0. What does Home SF do? It is literally the first housing plan legislation for middle-income San Franciscans. So what it says is that there are things called, I mean, this is where it gets, you know, you can start getting really boring. Area median incomes, right? Area median incomes. So the RHNA numbers, the regional housing, the regional housing needs assessment or something like that, has 4 buckets of housing numbers. Very low income, middle income, and then market rate income. In San Francisco, there was always this dialogue that, oh my God, we always have to be building affordable housing, and we do. I'm not saying we don't. But if you actually look at the RHNA numbers, the 2 areas that we actually do a pretty good job on is we build a pretty good amount of very low income housing. And we do a very good job of building market rate housing. The two middle income buckets, we are at 15% of our regional housing needs assessment numbers. That was set by the state. And what happens is that if you're a teacher, you don't qualify. You make too much money to qualify for the very low income housing, and you don't make enough money to get market rate housing. So what this Home SF does is it says, you know what, we're going to actually change the definition. We're going to expand the definition of affordable housing. And we're going to say that, yes, people who still make, you know, low income, we're still going to provide subsidies for them. But now what we're going to do is we're also going to say people who are making between 65% of AMI and 120% of AMI. And by the way, who are these people? Teachers, firefighters, first responders, the types of people that maybe if there was a major earthquake, we kind of would want to live in the city and not commuting 2 hours every day. So this program, Home SF, specifically builds housing. 30% of the housing units in a Home SF building needs to goes to people making between that, you know, 60% AMI, 120% AMI. So when you're thinking about like Home SF, think like that's teacher housing, that's firefighter housing, that's EMT housing, that's building people who build the buildings can live there. And so that's middle income housing. How's that?
I thought that was ethnic cleansing.
That, well, one person's middle income housing is another person's ethnic cleansing, yes.
And oddly enough, the San Francisco Association of Realtors had a ballot measure on the ballot last fall that looked at that very issue of expanding the definition, and it too failed and was viciously attacked. But suddenly we have supervisors who are talking about looking at those numbers at the Board of Supervisors. So funny how it works out.
Yeah, I mean, just to be fair, it is a little bit different, right? So the way that the Mayor's Office of Housing that gets money and gets tax credits and all that, we have about 5 different funding streams to provide for traditionally the low-income housing, and that those dollars get leveraged. And so the thing that's nice about Home SF is that it's not taking any of the dollars away from the mayor's office of housing. It's using the private market, giving this bonus, this density bonus, so that developers can then get more units, more market rate units, and that in exchange for that, they're going to offer 30% of their units for middle income. So, I mean, what I said originally is that we build a lot of traditional affordable housing, and we need to continue to build that. This is one little slice. Home SF is one little slice of a huge housing policy that is starting to address the need for middle-income housing in San Francisco.
So we went off on a crazy tangent around the millennials and what they're fearing, which was how we got there. But in terms of you know, those conversations, and do they see a place for themselves in the future of San Francisco? I mean, even with programs like Home SF and
That was the original question. Yeah, you know what, the conversations I have with millennials I find really fascinating, because they always say to me, the two things come up. They say, I think I can either afford a house or I can afford to, I want to have children, I want to live in San Francisco, I can either afford a house or I can afford sending my children to private school. I can't afford both. And I say, well, you know, I have 3 children in San Francisco, and we are very happy San Francisco Unified School District parents, my wife and I, you know, and we bought a house, so we didn't have to make that choice. But it is an interesting kind of mindset of like, I want to live here, great. I want to have a family, awesome. And then I think I'll be able to either afford a house or private school. So, you know, I want everyone in this room to like realize that, you know, investing in the public schools is important for the housing market. I mean, it's important that, you know, that we have really strong public schools to support families and people who want to be here. So I do think that millennials are going to, I mean, they are tireless, the millennials, I mean, and very impressive. I think they're going to do just fine.
Well, I mean, that's kind of an interesting point you bring up. The conversation when you used to talk about homes in neighborhoods with a home buyer was, you know, how much do the homes cost and how are the schools? Right, and now the conversation is how much does the home cost and how long is my commute? And you know, if that's, you know, people giving up on San Francisco schools, or you know, just the lack of children in the city, or
We have a very confusing assignment system, so that makes, you're not buying into a particular school.
So do you want to touch on that one at all?
That's too complicated. There's a lottery, and you get to rank, you know, one of 55 schools if you want.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot to explain San Francisco's, but when Spur's out looking at kind of other cities and you know, urban areas and education, how much does neighborhood choice and community-based schools, have you noticed any correlation with vibrant urban cities? Or, I mean, because what we're trying to correct for is a history of segregation. And so how do we correct for that? I mean, what does Spur see?
You know, we have not gotten into this particular topic. I mean, I think it's a difficult one to tackle. My children are also in public school. We happen to go to our neighborhood public school. We're very happy there. But I can understand that it's a daunting, uncertain process, and if you are looking at other places where you know that if you buy this house, your kids are going to go to this school, and you can look at the stats about this school, that is, San Francisco is definitely at a disadvantage if we're trying to retain families. And the system is put in place for a reason, to address segregation. Unfortunately, when they look at the stats about how the outcomes from that process, it's not actually doing a very good job at that.
So I want to shift gears. Josh, you know, you talked a lot about kind of zoning and the changes that have happened there and kind of undoing some of the damage kind of for more restrictive. How long does it typically take between kind of seeing those very high-level policy changes and the feeling down on, you know, the street for consumers feeling different around housing?
Good question. I'd just like to add, I have another public school parent up on this panel.
See, it is possible. Look, right? We've got a panelist of public school parents. So, 4.
Well, let's see. It actually, between adopting a new plan and actually seeing the first buildings being built, it isn't necessarily too long. Maybe, construction cranes going up, maybe within a year and a half. So, then add some actual construction time, another year and a half to 2 years. You're probably the first buildings from a new plan, probably at the earliest, maybe 3 years after a plan is approved. So that's usually what it takes. We've tried to set up in these recent plans a more expedited process with what we do is called programmatic environmental reviews. So we kind of cover all the broad bases, and if you're just kind of a typical project on a typical lot, you kind of just pay a little bit of an extra fee, and you kind of don't really have to do any additional environmental review, and so you can just kind of sail through and get your approvals, and then you're on your way.
So what would kind of be like a typical project on a typical lot that would qualify for something like this?
Maybe something that's in the range of, maybe, 50, 100 units, something like that. Maybe you're not substantially altering a historic building or tearing it down. You're not demolishing existing residential units. It's not a high-rise, so we don't have to do all sorts of like shadow and wind studies, that kind of stuff.
So a mid-sized, mid-rise building.
A mid-sized, mid-rise project. Usually they get through pretty fast. It's the taller buildings that you have to do all sorts of other technical studies on that are both the result of our environmental laws, but both of the result of just like the kind of analysis we need to do in general.
So
Those can add a couple of years to those kinds of projects. Yeah.
Just to add, several years ago, and the Mark Company's 20 years old this year, and I've been doing this longer than that. I mentioned to a developer I've not worked on a project where it has not taken from when the developer first tied up the property, and it could have been the former developer, to the first person moving in 7 years for mid-rise to high-rise. And there was an architect who's worked on a lot of projects that he hadn't worked on a building that's taken less than 10 years. So, that's a long, arduous process. As a sidebar, I did work on 8 Washington, and after 16 years, I said, okay, I'm probably not working on that anymore. But there were 3 developers, and then, as we all know, it was finally shut down for 132 units. And I have to say, in the interim, going to China a number of times and realizing how quickly 132 units would have been built.
Yeah, I would have to just say that, I was the lead planner for the Rincon Hill plan back in early 2000s. It was adopted in 2005. We thought that was a 20-year plan. It was going to take 15 years at least for this to build out. The whole neighborhood was built out in less than 10 years, and the first one, Rincon Hill, the tallest building, it sailed through like grease lightning through the entitlement process. One brief hearing, nobody spoke. The building was under construction in less than a year, and then a couple of years later, it can happen really fast if kind of everything comes together right. Once you get kind of in more mature, bigger plans like Eastern neighborhoods like Soma and the Mission, and it's been almost a decade since that plan was adopted. Kind of the political and social contract that was created through adopting that plan and all the consensus that was built around it has kind of fallen apart by this point, now that a lot of the growth has happened. And so now we're starting to see kind of all the sand in the gears of that kind of continuing to churn forward. But in the early years after plan is adopted, it's kind of like a honeymoon period, and stuff in South of Market and the Mission District and Dogpatch kind of sailed through for several years. And the recession kind of kept them from getting built for several years, but once it came back, they were already entitled and they could move. So, if someone can solve the problem of recessions and how to get stuff built in recessions, they should win the Nobel Prize. Because that's ultimately what, is kind of why, one reason why, we have like 1,400 units a year on average is because, the last few years we've been doing like, 3,000 to 5,000 units a year, but in 2011, about 250 units were built in this city. When you're averaging that, the average comes out much lower, but in the boom times we do quite well. So it's like, how do we keep building through the recessions?
I totally agree. And when one Rincon Hill did come up at the same time Infinity was opening, and Tishman Speyer thought it would take 2 years to get entitled. It took 5 years and $7 million. So that, of course, that cost is then added on to the purchase price.
So you mentioned the Rincon Hill plan and that kind of being a 20-year plan and obviously kind of eating through that much quicker. The next kind of one on up in the queue is the Central Soma plan. Is there any update or kind of where is that right now? And how do you think that will affect kind of what you just said in terms of honeymoon period and development?
Sure. Central Soma Plan, just so if you don't know, covers the area of South of Market from about 2nd Street to 6th Street. Most of the focus is south of Yerba Buena, mostly south of the freeway, kind of along where the Central Subway is being built now. We have some light at the end of the tunnel. I think we're probably going to be at adoption in the fall, October or so at the Planning Commission and through the board, hopefully by January or February at the latest. It creates capacity for several thousand more housing units and a few million square feet of job space. That plan has, I'd say I've had 2 kids in the time that we've been doing this plan, and my first son just finished kindergarten, but it wasn't, it wasn't the planning process up front. It took us a year and a half, 2 years to do the whole planning process. It's taken us, well, 4 or 5 years now to do the environmental review process. And that is what has kind of slowed down this whole thing and kind of ground it to a halt, and has frustrated all of us who've been chomping at the bit and all the folks who want to build. So that's, but I think we're finally there.
And kind of as long as we're on neighborhood plans, SF Planning kind of got a lot of pushback for the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan in the sense that, neighbors felt that it was too broad of an area, that it was too big. What does planning learn from that in terms of, what's an ideal neighborhood plan size, and kind of going forward, how do you balance trying to rezone and get things moving so development can happen and being sensitive to existing neighborhood conditions?
It was way too big. The Eastern Neighborhoods. It was maybe a little naive a process going into it. It was, we thought, the planning director at the time thought, we're just going to rezone these industrial lands and it'll be kind of a technical exercise. We'll be done with it fast. But sure enough, you can't just rezone people's neighborhoods and not talk about parks and streets and all those kinds of things. So it snowballed, obviously, into a much bigger process that then ended up being focused on each individual neighborhood. Thinking about what really is the natural size of a neighborhood that people think of as a neighborhood and not biting off too much and really going into it knowing what a process it'll take to get through it. You're talking about it minimum a 4 or 5 year commitment to do the whole thing and to see it through to the end.
Any other folks, from your kind of standpoint, Alan, when developers are interacting with neighborhood plans and trying to, my experience of developers has always been that they like to build projects that really honor the neighborhood in San Francisco. What's their balance or what's their thought process like when they're trying to balance, the bottom line and numbers and getting something built and working with a neighborhood?
They do realize the end goal is to get it entitled. So that they do go in thinking, who do I have to work with, especially the community groups. At the same time, they realize they do have to make sure it's profitable. When we work with a developer, we always talk about neighborhoods as having a certain dialect. So if we're doing something in Hayes Valley, it's very different than if we're doing something in Jackson Square. But Scott Wiener had mentioned Park Merced. I know the person who kind of spearheaded it for the developer, and after the approvals, he said, I'm so happy I can now spend the evenings with my children because I've been to 298 community meetings. So something has to change there. The one thing kind of goes back to what Todd was talking about. We love the city, we love diversity, the middle class need a place to live, but I do see developers both here and in LA really going for the high-end, very high-end product because with the cost of construction and the arduous process, the numbers are only working on the high end. So as we move through the end of this decade into the new decade, if there are about 1,500 units that'll be on the market, there's this tight cluster from a quadrant that's east of First Street, south of Mission, that 500 units will probably be north of $2 to $3 million out of the 1,500. And I think there's a huge gap. So kind of answering your question, I mean, developers need to make a profit, but they're also looking at, of course, demographics, but getting it entitled too.